yeah, we're looking out for some talent. If there's somebody you think that, we're very, very, right, so I'm gonna, if you just take the thing on, just make sure it's the right level. And the trouble is, when people come in, then it all changes.
Is that, yeah.
So that's a little bit more.
Too loud?
Try it again, Robin.
What? Yeah?
That's quite good. Say 1, 2.
Is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? 1, 2, 1, 2, yeah.
How many children you got? You got the treating daughters.
Yeah. I've got. Do I want to announce this? No. Oh. We were having a private conversation.
So yeah, so if you just put it on the red.
Put it on the red.
So you slide it across towards the left. So go 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. One, two, three. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
Okay, so if you mute it now. If you mute it now, put it onto the
Okay.
red now.
Okay, let's go.
1, 2. So you'll use that.
What's that feedback? Bobby? Feedback. Quite loud. Mark? Do you hear it? Don't want it. Is that still working? Data logger. It was getting feedback.
Oh, it's getting feedback, is it? Yeah, well, you said. I did.
Okay. Are you good to go? Can't have it. Why is this here? Why is it here?
So you'll have to be.
Why have we got a CO2 meter? We don't need it. It's making a noise. Right. Should we go? You go. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to you all. Hello there. Hello. Louder still? That's very. I'm not often asked to be louder. How's that? Can you hear me? Can you hear me at the back? Jolly good. So welcome to everyone. Fantastic to see so many of you here. And I have been instructed very firmly to announce there is going to be a beach cleanup on Monday the 8th at the bottom of Harrison Drive at 10 a.m. and you don't get a cookie and a biscuit and coffee unless you're there for an hour. 10 o'clock at the bottom of Harrison Drive on Monday, May the 8th. But the business at hand is two very distinguished speakers, two professors with us today. Robin Grove White, has been Professor of Environment and Society at Lancaster. And for those who are old enough, and there's probably quite a few of us, he was a scriptwriter for That Was the Week That Was, which is indeed a great accolade. And he was also on the edge of the law as chair of Greenpeace UK, causing trouble, I presume, the chair of Greenpeace UK. And he was raised in Anglesey and came back 20 years ago and living in Anglesey since then. Honorary Fellow at Bangor and a former High Sheriff of Gwynedd. So a very distinguished speaker. And we also have Professor Gareth Wyn-Jones, who just tells me he spent a lot of time in Pakistan, in Faisalabad. He graduated in biochemistry and soil science from University College of North Wales, which is Bangor. Went on to Universities of British Columbia, Oxford, UCLA, and then Bangor as an academic, and did a lot of work on plant adaptation to salinity and drought, including in Pakistan, presumably. Yeah. And Chief Scientist, Countryside Council for Wales, and an honorary member of the Bardic Circle. So we have two very, very strong speakers. So it's a double act, and first of all, Professor Grove White is going to tell us about... Are you switched on your mics? You're not switched on. Let me do that.
Yes.
There you go. Professor Grove White's going to do a little introductory thing, and then we've got some slides, and then we'll get some more comments from Professor Grove White. So let us start straight away.
Do I stand?
No, I don't.
No. Okay, good. That's better. Well, good evening, and wonderful to be here, and terrific audience. Wow. So here's the question for this evening. Can we talk honestly about climate change and what its full meanings are likely to be for all of us? Can we avoid wishful thinking in talking about it? I'm not an expert, I'm just an ordinary individual with his own experiences, but I want to share some apprehensions I've got about what I think is coming down the pike towards us. And it seems to me that people like us need to grapple much more seriously with what the implications are likely to be and the prospects ahead. Because the bottom line is, as regards climate change, the situation is already beyond serious. Within the next 2 decades, that's just 20 years, we're going to be faced with a serious threat, not just to the environment out there, but to our very way of life, our civilization. And it's going to affect all of us, even here in our haven of Anglesey. As you've heard from Owen, Gareth and I have been around these sorts of issues for quite a while. Gareth, with his career as a botanical scientist, dealing with problems in different parts of the world, facing food production on the ground in many countries. And he and I are close working colleagues now, particularly following his book, The Energy, the Great Driver. As you'll hear, he knows a lot more about the scientific technicalities of climate change than me. My rather different perspective is that of a social scientist. I was drawn into what was then the embryonic environmental movement in the early 1970s, and then I worked as a lobbyist, a full-time lobbyist in the 70s and 80s for the Council for Protection of Rural England and various other organisations, and as Owens mentioned, became chair of Greenpeace. Now, it was in the late 80s, as the Cold War was ending, that the threat of climate change began to come into focus for governments. And this was reflected in the United Nations rapid creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988, as most of you will know. And associated with that, what became known as the COP process, the Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So national governments required to become signatories and to commit themselves. Now, it's very easy to overlook how really path-breaking and innovative these institutional developments, the creation of these two entities, IPCC and the COP, have been and continue to be, because what they do is they link what is an evolving, rapidly growing science of climate change with the political world, with the world of governments, on a continuing basis. And year on year, IPCC's scientific understandings of the global climate predicament have become steadily more solid and robust. The knowledge has become absolutely confident now. And we can track this strengthening of confidence, of intellectual confidence in the reality of climate change and the dangers of it in their successive reports, 6 of them over the past 3 decades. And the most recent one, last month indeed, is unambiguous about the existential seriousness for humanity of climate. So gradually, through successive COP conferences, Glasgow last year, of course, governments have been agreeing on grudging nation-by-nation commitments to reducing carbon in the atmosphere by progressively reducing emissions, primarily by moving away from fossil fuels to power our economies and industrial societies. However, there are now well-grounded fears that what's been signed up to, what's been agreed, let alone implemented, is going to prove too little, too late. And I'm choosing my words carefully there. Gareth, do you want to show us some features of this situation?
Well, the first slide there is both a list of some of the conferences that have taken place up to 2020 and the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, which is measured with great exactitude in Hawaii and other places around the world. And then the lower part is a representation of the increase in mean global temperature over that period of time, starting from 1960 up to 2020. It's a bit of a fudge because, of course, it isn't exactly as smooth as that, but it shows you a lot of talk, and the CO2 has gone up at exactly the same rate, even accelerated over that time with a concomitant increase in temperature.
Go on.
I go on, right? Oh, the axis is this is parts per million carbon dioxide. If you go back down here, it would have been 270 at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it's now about 422. Okay?
And this is 1960 to 2020. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it's a bit small.
Go on, that's the screen.
Robin was saying about urgency. This is a representation of urgency. I'll stand. This is carbon dioxide emissions, essentially from burning fossil fuels on this axis, and the black line is the record, again from about 1980, going up regularly. Something has happened. Let's come back. Don't touch the screen is the answer. And these lines are the projections of how much we have to decrease emissions in order to avoid an increase of more than 2 degrees, whereas the Paris conference was 1.5, and that's a lost cause. So we're looking at 2 degrees, and these are the lines. And basically the message is, the longer you leave it, the sharper the cuts have to be, and the more likelihood is that you'll overshoot. That's what this slide shows clearly. And very quickly to quantify it, we emit about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, and about 50 billion tons of other gases, or the total number of gases that produce climate change. So that's the baseline of how much we're doing now, and we've not cut at all yet. So we have a 50-50 chance of not exceeding 1.5. There's a residual amount of 500, and we're using 50 or 40 or 50 of that per year. Right, that's the rate of change. And to get down to 2 degrees, to avoid 2 degrees, we've got about something like over 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So again, it's speed. The only extra point I want to make here is that is ignoring methane. And methane is the big issue. We're going to have beef lasagna tonight, I understand. And of course, the meat has produced a lot of methane.
No.
I know that. I'm just making a point. And if we decrease methane emissions, then we have a bigger and faster effect than if we reduce CO2. There's not a time to discuss why that is the case, because we've only got half an hour. But I'm happy to discuss it with anybody afterwards. At long last, the big companies are taking interest. And these 3 slides are from projected scenarios from BP, what used to be called British Petroleum at one time. And these are their scenarios. The green one at the top is essentially what has already been promised. And that's the rate of decline. The second one is with assumptions about a much more rapid rate of reduction. And the bottom one, the blue one, is the line that we would have to address to get to net zero or close to net zero by 2050.
This is carbon emissions.
These are carbon emissions, yes.
Yeah.
And it's, again, it's from 2000 to 2050.
Yeah.
And we're there.
Yeah. We're actually past that already.
What's the y-axis?
Yeah. This is
This axis.
this the carbon emissions.
Total, sorry, they can't see what the units are either.
Oh, sorry, they are in billion tons of carbon dioxide.
And what is the range?
Yeah, it's from 0 to 45. And at the back you have no
40.
chance at all, I'm afraid.
You're explaining it very well.
No, we need a big screen, I'm afraid. But the take-home message is the same, that we need rapid cuts from the current emissions of about 40 to... I'm sorry, to explain why I seem a little uncertain. There are 2 types of measurements. You either look at carbon dioxide by itself or all the other gases as equivalents to carbon dioxide. And so there's and the scientists, being difficult people, use gigatons, whereas ordinary people talk in billions. But a billion is the same as Geiger. So when you see in a scientific paper Geiger, it means billions in ordinary language. And so essentially methane adds about 20% to our total emissions. Right, so these are the projections that have been made by BP, and the lower ones have some pretty unlikely assumptions. And then people have tried to work out, right, with these projections, what might be the mix of fuels that will provide us with energy. Because clearly we have to have energy for the future. Without any energy, we wouldn't be here as we are today. So these, and the assumptions are that there will be a huge decline in coal, a substantial decline in oil, and a substantial decline in natural gas, and electricity will go up enormously. So we have to hugely increase our production of electricity from renewables, and the big issue in Anglesey, do we have nuclear or not? No. There are very strong opinions on either side of that, whether nuclear actually is a renewable energy source. Many people will say no, other people will argue that it is. We can have an interesting discussion of that later on. Okay. And just to finish these quick slides, look out the window, you'll see the floodplain. This is a projection from the current flood risk of the flood in once every 100 years. This would be underwater. If you look at an American paper that Robin found the other day, by 2050, that is a projection of the flood risk outside this window every year. That's the rate of change we're looking at, and we're very lucky to be standing here today looking out of that window on an area where the risk is obvious.
So the risk you're saying now is once in 100 years?
Yes.
Yeah.
But in 2050 it'll be every year?
Yep.
Yep.
That's the projections. There are uncertainties, huge uncertainties, but I think it's a good way of visualizing what we're about. Robin.
Yeah. Can you go back to the one before? Sorry, the previous one. Yeah. There we are.
No, it's good.
There. Right. I know you can't see these, but I want to refer to them just once. So this is the mixture as now, and we've got to get down here, and we've got to get down here basically in 25 years. In fact, government, the target now is a 45% reduction in national carbon emissions over the next 7 years by 2030.
By 2030.
So we're talking about incredibly tight timetables. Now, so we're there, and that's where we've got to get to. Look at the assumptions that are built into these trajectories. First of all, they assume that governments are going to be able to deliver on their commitments to move away from fossil fuels in favor of renewables, especially sun and wind, within these very drastic timetables. You know, consider the ambition of this. And in truth, of course, they're falling behind as everyday political priorities come into conflict with good intentions. As we can see, for example, with the vacillations of the present government over onshore wind, or the absence of action on methane in agriculture, as Gareth mentioned, and the recent granting of licenses for new oil fields and coal mines. These two scenarios also assume that stately progress towards a complete absence of carbon, net zero, or other, of carbon emissions, isn't going to be thrown off course by inevitable political economic upsets. you name it, 2008 financial crash, COVID, Brexit, Ukraine war. How confident are you feeling about that? Or again, there's the assumption, again, baked into these scenarios, that the world's banks and financial institutions will rapidly abandon the financing of new fossil fuel investments in favor of renewables, when in reality, fossil fuel investments worldwide are continuing at an all-time high. And the Bankers Alliance, the celebrated Global Finance Alliance on Net Zero, launched at the Glasgow COP conference last year by Mark Carney, is already breaking up because the biggest banks, the American banks in particular, just don't want to play on these strict terms. Or another embedded assumption, again in these figures, that we'll be able to rely on a massive scale on technologies which are still only in their infancy. For example, in relation to carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, or the removal of methane from agricultural production. So clearly, to me, we would be prudent to rely on the judgments of the growing number of independent scientists who say that the world is now heading for excess of 2 degrees centigrade within the next 10 or 15 years. And once we're into there, we're into the zone of accelerating feedbacks. And what will that look like? Sorry, not many jokes here, but I want to take you through this and you'll see why at the end. Just based on articles in Nature, within the next 2 decades, let's say in the 2030s, we can picture climate change triggering an interlocking series of tumultuous events which will feed off one another. Immense, uncontrollable boreal forest fires racing across Alaska, Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia, orders of magnitude greater than the forest fires we've seen in recent years in California and Australia, resulting not only in colossal damage and loss of life, but also in months of smoke across the atmosphere of the Northern Hemisphere, with all sorts of implications for agricultural production, for example, and health. We can picture as well that the ice sheets of the Arctic and Antarctic are going to start breaking up more rapidly, creating sea level rises, unpredictable, very unpredictable, but with huge worldwide consequences, swamping coastal zones and cities at great human and economic cost. And simultaneously, one might picture the South Asian monsoons failing for 2 or 3 years in succession, which is now a real possibility, which would force literally hundreds of millions of people to flee their homes, escaping from famine and ruined agriculture. And we can picture the ripple effects of such physical events then ramifying into world food production, into food supply chains and patterns of world trade, and the displacement of millions of refugees and asylum seekers. The UN is now predicting 1.5 billion climate refugees by 2050, within 25, 27 years. And we can even picture hot wars over water resources, for example, with India and Pakistan, Egypt and Ethiopia, real potential hotspots. Our own country's current difficulties in responding to new refugee arrivals to date are going to pale into insignificance compared with what can be expected. Now, these aren't cast iron predictions. or inevitabilities. They're just very strong likelihoods, I'm afraid. Obviously, there are many indeterminacies in our knowledge, but the underlying patterns are clear. We know a great deal now about the physical and biological dynamics of climate change. But just to add to the misery, what's less appreciated, and it's outside the scope of the IPCC, is what the secondary and tertiary consequences, the human consequences of these upheavals are likely to be. We all know that these are unsettled times for democracies like ours anyway, quite apart from climate change issues. We've got discontent with the way our political institutions are working. There's dismay at the growing inequalities of income and opportunity, anxieties at the speed of change, of technological change, you know, with AI in prospect and so forth, and our valued institutions like the NHS creaking at the seams. In this rather anxious context, many of the civil society bodies, and this is where I get back to my own sort of experience of the NGO world, pressing for more radical action to ward off climate change, have so far been keeping faith with the IPCC and COP processes. You know, they've relied on them, they've trusted these processes. But it's disturbing to me that a moment of truth seems to be coming. You can feel it in the current debates around Extinction Rebellion, about appropriate strategies of protest. On the one, they're more radical than Greenpeace, but they're not radical enough for people like Andreas Malm, the Swedish activist, author of How to Blow Up a Pipeline. How long is it going to be on present trajectories before we see peaceful demonstrating superseded by more direct and aggressive interventions, sabotage, and even terrorism? As failure to ward off climate-driven events around the globe leads to increasing disillusion and desperation by people who really feel passionately about these things I've just been outlining. And won't this in turn produce counter-reactions from the right of the political spectrum as the politics of denial are replaced by blame, conspiracy theories, paranoia, on the lines we're seeing in the United States, perhaps? And what will be the cascading, collective, psychological impacts on public consciousness across countries worldwide, as people like us realize there's no escape? It's too late to do anything meaningful to prevent these intensifying processes. These are surely the combined circumstances in which it's realistic to fear catastrophic social breakdown. And beyond that lurks the spectre of Mad Max. In a brilliant recent book called The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh has pointed to the close interest that security services worldwide are now taking in the implications of climate change for individual states. The politics of the armed lifeboat is the phrase he uses, where nation states become increasingly defensive and authoritarian in what will ultimately be futile attempts to secure their own borders against ramifying global threats. And where's Anglesey in all this? I haven't forgotten her. Well, surely we're safe in our lotus land. Perhaps we can expect a decade of wonderful summers and a booming tourist industry over the very immediate period. But Gareth says, as Gareth's charts show, occasional floods are going to become annual floods. The mainline railway across the island is going to be at risk, deeply affected. And to put it no more strongly, we can expect intensifying pressures on the housing market and on public services, with growing numbers of people wanting to retreat here. So all the tensions with which we're becoming familiar between old and new populations, you might say, although we handle it extremely civilized fashion here, these difficulties are likely to be amplified. But the reality is that we can't hide from this. We are as much a part of the global community as anywhere else. And the bottom line is, it seems to me, we really are now approaching global tipping points triggered by climate change, with massive implications for our way of life. And of course, we must all hope that all that can be done to avert this will be done, and that some of the ambitions that are captured in those slides that Gareth's shown will be realized through the vast range of official initiatives underway. But it seems to me, personally, it's time for us to get real in a way that governments aren't getting real, and start talking about how we're going to respond to these new situations with a clear, shared recognition of how bad things could get sooner than we've been thinking. I don't doubt that not everyone here agrees with this, but don't we need to face up to and talk about these possibilities collectively for ourselves? Indeed, mightn't it even be a relief to be talking more openly about what probably lies ahead? Seems to me this is a new kind of challenge for society, and it's one on which official bodies, whether they're central government or local authorities or public agencies, that they're not in a position to take a lead, locked as they are into the IPCC and COP ways of doing things. And in this sense, maybe the neutral languages of science have drained out some of the life out of this issue and made it feel, as it were, beyond our reach. I don't know. I'd be interested to know what people think. But I think things have to start locally. These sorts of issues, these sort of perspectives need to be engaged with at a local level. So perhaps Ross Niger thinks has a role to play.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Both passionate and apocalyptic. So,
well,
I've just got a couple of questions before I throw this out to everyone here. I mean, the arguments you hear in Parliament a lot are the UK is too small to make a difference, and that net zero is just never going to happen. It's too expensive. It's not going to happen. So it is ridiculous policy to set a goal that nobody thinks is going to be achieved. So how would you respond to those 2 points? First of all, the UK is not big enough. It's all happening in China. It's all happening in the fast-growing parts of the world. And we can go to net zero. It won't make any difference.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that may very well be right, that we can't make any difference. And that our responses at a policy level are relatively insignificant. But that's not my point. My point is, what do we do? We're the ones who are going to have to deal with this. And is a more frank and open recognition of what is going to be involved a possible trigger for different kinds of action to put pressure on governments and for them to then translate that through these global institutions? I mean, the only thing is, if I accepted what you said, Owen, we just sort of fiddle while Rome burns. Is that the prescription?
Well, I think maybe what happens,
Yeah.
and it may not be a desirable outcome, but I mean, is it realistic to think about net zero by the target date?
No, I don't believe it is.
No.
No. What do you think, Gareth?
Two things I would say. First of all, this business it's not our responsibility. All the evidence shows that it is the better off, on the whole, white population of the world, which has been responsible for and is still responsible for the vast amount of the greenhouse gases that are released. So it is very much our historical responsibility and our present responsibility compared with the average Joe Bloggs living in the middle of say, Africa or in Pakistan, or in India for that matter. Our emissions per capita are about 3 to 4 times as high as India. So there are a lot of Indians, but we're the per capita sources of emissions. In terms of the crash at the end, all the data shows that the quicker you can reach as low as possible, the least will be the long-term catastrophe. So even though we cannot avoid quite a substantial crash, I would say, I agree with you, then it is our responsibility for ourselves, but particularly for our children and our grandchildren, that we should do all we possibly can, personally and collectively, to reduce our emissions as soon as possible.
So I will come to you in a moment, but just to understand this, the initial goal of the Paris meeting, I think, was 1.5
Yeah.
by
2050.
By 2050. And now you're saying that's just not going to happen.
That's right.
It's going to be 2% by 2050.
That's right.
And given that net zero is going to be very hard here, never mind anywhere else, what is your prediction for where we will be in 2050 in temperature terms?
I'm not an atmospheric physicist, but I would say between 2 and 2.5. The thing I would like to say about that is this number of 1 and 2 is actually quite misleading. It refers to the mean global increase in the temperature, and the temperature over land is increasing faster than over the oceans. So the current 1.1, 1.2 is already, if you go take the Australian continent, it's well over 1.5, and if you go to Svalbard, it's between 2, 3 and 4 degrees. So different places are warming at different rates, and the 1.5 is the 1.5 was a convenient Paris sort of headline.
It was a target,
Yeah, it's a headline target, but under that it hides all sorts of very bad things, which we should be aware of and not ignore.
I mean, I have to say, given the graphs, I'm slightly surprised you didn't come up with a higher number than 2.5 in a way. But anyway, let's...
Well, it could well be.
Yeah, sorry. So I have the microphone, so Owen allowed me to have a go. Thank you very much for such a fantastic talk. So really, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I was remembering, as a student, I used to have a bread bin, and in the bread bin, because it didn't always get cleared out properly, there was a piece of bread that gradually got mouldy, and it started off with nice blue mould, and then it got a little bit drier and it went to a white mould, and then it just dried out and all the mould died. And I think I'm feeling a little bit like a bit of that blue mould at the moment, and I don't know what to do.
No.
And that mould didn't have any agency at all, whereas maybe we do. If we can do something clever.
Yes. Well, yes, Mark.
But what's clever?
Okay, let's get some questions, yeah.
Is your house mouldy too?
So it used to be, but it's not anymore.
Good, good. I mean, I think that's, we all live somewhere. So,
Yeah.
come on.
You are. You need to put it right.
Quite close, yeah.
We all live in a house. When I came to live here in Anglesey, a lovely place to live, we decided that these scenarios have been clear for a while. So the least that we can do is make our house carbon neutral.
Mm.
You can't do that with it. You can't build a passive. You have to start from fresh for a passive house. But everybody's house can be retrofitted. So we've now had, that's been done a year or so in our house. That little piece of paper that your EPC, which everybody has to get if you become a seller of a house. The guy who came to survey said you can't do better than this. This has been done by local builders with guidance of an architect who. But an old 1970s bungalow. We've made our house carbon. It doesn't emit carbon now. There's embedded carbon in, obviously. But that's been possible with our retirement lump sums. Now, we've got different houses, so it's not one size fits all. Air source heat pumps don't fit all situations, but we can all start with where we live. I think that you can't get more local than where you live. But it's not enough to do your own, because you can't insulate, though that's part of the pattern for us. You can't insulate yourself against climate change. The next thing is to work with whatever community you are living in. Work together with others. I mean, especially listen to the children. I have one story from my previous life as a vicar in Manchester. Children went to the Manchester Cathedral and told the dean, "Oh, it's a leaky church, you'll have to get rid of those stained glass windows." And I thought, oh dear, these seeds are going to fall on stony ground. Manchester Cathedral now has one of the greenest heating systems of any cathedral in the country. Because although he didn't remove the stained glass windows, he remembered what the children said, the dean, when their heating system died to death, and has been replaced by ground source heating. And so it shows that working with others, working with the local schools, listen to them, see what can be done locally. That's all you can do, isn't it? St David, the patron saint of Wells, said, remember, as he died, remember what I taught you. Do the little things. We can't save the planet on our own, but we can do the little things in our own backyard.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Like that. Is that better? Okay. Thank you very much. I understand that we need to do something clever, and I think there's lots of people much cleverer than I am that are trying to figure that out. But I'm just wondering why, or if you know, why we're not investing more, or the government isn't investing more in tidal energy, which is more constant than either solar or... We do get a lot of wind here, but not enough to solve the problem. And solar's a bit inconsistent in Rossniger. But tide is constant, and we've got a big coastline, so why can't the UK do something about that?
Well, I think I missed last month. It was all on tidal energy.
Yes.
But what's your take?
I couldn't catch the question. Sorry.
So yeah, basically, why isn't more being done to get tidal energy?
Well, I don't. They are working very hard on Holyhead, fair play, for tidal flow energy. I don't understand the reluctance of government to go for the tidal lagoons off the coast. It seems to me that that is a less environmentally fraught way to go forward than to put nuclear power stations up, personally, because it doesn't commit you to something in 1,000 years' time. On the whole, it's to do with the way the people do their economic calculations and who is pressurising government for one reason or another. And I would like to see more done on tidal energy as you suggest.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello?
Yeah.
Right.
So I banged on a bit about tidal energy last time, so I shouldn't be holding the floor again, but I think there has to be a big sense of reality into what tidal can produce. If that whole zone off South Stack gets developed, it'll produce 340 megawatts when everything's working tickety-boo. That's about the equivalent of a third of one modern wind farm, of which I wouldn't say dozens, but certainly a significant number are being built in the North Sea at the moment. I think tidal is, and it's also very, very expensive. When you look at the contract for difference values that are being given to these tidal projects, they are about 5 times new offshore wind, and I therefore question whether tidal's going to ever get more than niche and expensive. And I think my personal view on lagoons is they could be a complete environmental disaster because they will produce massive breakwaters the size we've never ever seen before. And if they don't work or they get superseded by something else, we're going to get the most huge industrial scars in our seascape that we'll regret forever.
Patrick, didn't people say this about wind 10, 15 years ago, that it was too expensive, would never work, and just the sort of thing you're saying?
I think the thing with wind is it occurs over a huge area. With tide, you only get decent flow around these headlands like here, South Wales, Orkney. There's only relatively few places that it has just got enough flow to make these machines work properly.
Okay. Let's take another question. Press over. Yeah.
Hello, could I ask you two learned gentlemen, before I ask another question, is do you consider James Lovelock a crackpot?
Ah.
Why don't you tell us what James Lovelock said?
Oh, well, he wrote many books, but the Gaia hypothesis really.
That the Earth will have its revenge,
yes,
and the Earth will survive even if
yes,
we have to be eliminated for that to work. The Earth is a strong
It's just
force.
interesting because shortly before he, his last book, he did say that we have absolutely no chance at all about stalling global warming. And our biggest problem will be civil defence.
So is the Gaia theory correct? And are we well, Robert, you've sort of got towards saying
Well, I think it's a powerful metaphor, and Gareth will say something about the science. I mean, yeah, that you can take that attitude, but I don't take that. Do you take that attitude when your own children and grandchildren are facing the possibility in the next 20 years of being in a, not just a very hot and very, climatically disturbed society, but a deeply disordered one. I mean, the point about the point I'm trying to make about climate change is that almost certainly there aren't technological solutions to this. And almost certainly the worst effects of it are going to be on human civilization. Now, that didn't bother Lovelock at all. He was a fatalist about that. And he was very charming in the way he framed it. But it's not what my concern is. My concern is there anything, by talking about the real immediate, but by being hard-eyed and realistic about what is coming down the pike and talking about this and sharing our sense of it, and can we avoid what Mark pointed out of feeling dried out by the prospect? Very often you have to hit bottom in order to start moving forward. And it seems to me that the discussion, the science has done wonderful things in identifying climate change, but as I was hinting earlier, it's had a poisoning effect on public discussion, on public engagement. The measured, calm, detached approach, has distanced us all from these human realities that we're going to have to wrestle with. That's my point.
The question in front of you, asking. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for that, chaps. Very much a hell of fire and brimstone sermon. You were saying that by 2050 we'll be up to 2 degrees.
Or more.
Or
yeah,
more.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting because that will take us to about the level we were at in the medieval warm period. If we go up to 3 degrees more, that will take us to what it was like in the Roman warm period. And if we go 5 degrees, that'll take us to what it was like when Stonehenge was built.
Mhm.
Now, was that catastrophic? I don't think it was.
Over to you, Gareth.
With the greatest respect, sir, your facts are wrong. Let's start off there, right? That is not true. I'm reading a book at the moment about the cold period in the 1700s or so, right? The temperature change was probably less than 0.2 degrees, and there's no evidence at all that it was worldwide. It was spasmodic in certain places, and I'm afraid the information that you gave out now is typical of the denier websites, and if you look at the data, it ain't true.
Right, well, I can give you a list of the denial websites. I've got actually have them here. NASA, NOAA, Goddard Institute for Space Science, the British Antarctic Survey, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science. That's where I get my denier information from. Now,
Yes, we are.
Let me understand what your question is. Your question basically is, even if it is a very significant temperature increase by, let's say, 4 or 5%, that
not
it is
degrees.
degree, but it is not that catastrophic. So could I ask you to address that point?
Yes.
I will address that point. Let me give you a very simple example from Pakistan, because we're both in Pakistan. Yeah. Last summer in Pakistan, they had these enormous floods. 10% of the country was underwater. That was with the current change. But the example I would like to quote to you, because of the change in the seasons, it warmed much earlier in the Punjab last spring than had been for generations in the past. As a consequence, there was a 30% decrease in the winter wheat crop in Pakistan that year. Now, with the small change that's taken place, so it's small changes because of the huge population and the pressure on the world can have huge social consequences, as Robin is saying. And I think that we have to face that fact. And I don't think the examples you quoted are that helpful.
Well, frankly, I'm very interested in what you say. I mean, I don't. It's so radically at odds with what the IPCC is saying.
No.
Well,
if you read the latest one, AR6, which I'm about halfway through, there's 3,000 odd pages of it, and it's hard work. I did go through AR4. I missed out 5. AR6 has got some amazingly wrong stuff in it. I mean,
last year's one.
The one that produced and has just been published in March.
Right.
The latest IPCC report.
Yes.
Yes. The synthesis report.
Okay, so just to give you one more go at this, what is your concern about the latest IPCC report?
Well, the report, that would take a whole evening to go through that. What we have, if I can just show this, I don't know if you can see it, it's very small for you, but that is the catastrophic rise in temperature. And you can see it goes from 1880 to 2022. And you can see it's a massive rise, and it's about in the same line as that rise in CO2. So obviously, CO2 is the villain. Now, the same data is there, which is virtually a flat line, because since 1880 to the present time, there's been a 1.1 degree rise in temperature. So what we're all being fed is things like that on the media, when in truth, that is the same data. What they've done is show you the anomaly, and that is showing you the absolute.
Okay. All right. It's quite hard to follow this sort of these graphs at this distance. So we've got your skepticism.
I'm very happy to come back.
Yeah.
I've got all this stuff and a lot more on file, and I will give you
Yeah.
a talk on climate change.
Well, I hope you've.
The IPCC, what they have in the... Can we do this in a
It's all right, Mark.
organised way, please?
I hope you feel you've had a chance to say. Let's have another question at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, first, thank you to our presenters for taking us through kind of the science and the policy and the data. But the best part of the presentation, I think, is how you wrapped it up and said, what can we do in Russ Niger? And we have a room of engaged people. And another member of our audience said it starts at home. What I'd love to hear is what are the simple things that we can do as individual residents in Russ Niger to start making a difference, to lead by example, to start at home. What are those simple things we can do? Oh, and you did a great job of reminding everybody we have a beach clean Monday, a bank holiday, coronation weekend, but what are those other things that we can do just as a community to positively support and make some adjustments for climate change?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm interested in John's points about the radical difference that he's articulated between us, and it's clear that that's at odds with a great deal of the official, the general trajectory of your thinking, not so much the detail, but the trajectory of thinking is at odds with what governments and the IPCC and governments are saying and acting on. Now, so there's a huge gap between what you're saying and what we're saying. And I think that's what we could talk about. I think that we can't do it in this in exactly this context, but I think we, try to discuss this, because if I'm right, if this is right, and it's it's pretty strongly supported, whatever you say, then we're in a real pickle. But there's a sort of impasse at the moment, because the issue is conducted in terms of esoteric graphs and numbers, and requires a lot of sophistication to keep abreast of what levels of discussion are going on. We're paralyzed. And that's what alarms me as someone who thinks something big is happening. So we've got to, so in terms of what we could do locally, it's much more in that sort of vein, whether it's by being creative and having some sort of smaller groups discussions or something, to see a way through. I see no one engaging with this nationally in that sort of way.
So you're saying that there's the energy stuff you can do on your home and
oh yes, all that, yes. And we're all doing that.
But you're saying there's then basically more discussion, more politics from you.
Well, I think we need to invent a new politics, and it can only come from below, because it's not going to come from the established institution.
Away from politics.
Well, it's got, you can't escape politics.
Yes, you can escape politics. And
Well,
Okay. let's go to this question here. Yeah.
Sorry, I understand where you're coming from.
Could you get quite close so we can hear you?
Sorry, I understand where you're coming from. And my concern is, it's such a terrible story you tell. It's having a terrible effect on our young people. I work at Geomon in Antelope Port, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And we lecture to people about the geology of the whole Earth from 2 billion years ago to the present day. And I had a young couple in, they were about 24, and I followed them outside and showed them the fossils in the wall of the building. And I said to them, my kids used to collect...
So just check, can you hear at the back? Not really.
Sorry. My kids used to collect fossils and pebbles, right? This was down at Geomon in
Yes.
Right, okay? Now the point I'm getting is that those people said to me, we don't have children and we're not going to have children. The state of the world is such, all these extinctions and all this sort of thing. Now that is the sort of negative stuff that you're generating. I went to a talk on climate change in Bangor University where the corrupt professors were spelling it worse than what you said. Kids, young girls were crying their eyes out because they're all going to die.
Okay.
I mean, that is so destructive and it's not necessary, it's not true, and we have the technologies to get out of it. Right?
Okay, let me just, in case you didn't hear, the point basically is that some younger people are so panicked by this that getting to the point of not having children, so as to not damage the environment, is having significant impact on young people's lives, and that therefore this is a sort of moral panic that's undesirable.
Yes, that is the argument, and I hear what you say. So we're at an impasse. No, it's not you. It's not. Neither you can't tell me what to do. I can't tell you what to do. Oh, I'll give a talk.
Please, can we just have a discussion on the microphone?
It's good to discuss this.
I just want to say, yes, I understand what you're saying. And what you're saying is the nub of the problem. How do we actually try and avoid the worst consequences? Our colleague John thinks it's a vast exaggeration. From my experience, I'm not an atmospheric physicist, but I have travelled a lot and worked in a lot of places which are on the margins as it is. And marginal, as I quoted in Pakistan, marginal changes do have a huge impact on societies. And we are faced with this dilemma now. We have a society which is locked into energy use and growth. Our pensions, most of us here are on our pensions, are locked into this system. And we are the beneficiaries of this. How are we therefore going to create a conversation, as Robin is trying to do now, to find a way through this impasse? Because the longer we leave it, all the evidence, despite what John says, suggests the worse it will come. Therefore, we have a responsibility, I would say, to discuss it openly and to explain to our children and our grandchildren, yes, we are trying to do things and we will help you to do things because in the long run, it's in your interests and in your children's interests that we do as much as we can as soon as we can.
But let me just put the point to Robin. I mean, you shared Greenpeace, which generally speaking have a lot of young people who are extremely passionate and campaigning, and I don't know what happened when in the years you were running it, but it is something which engages people who are anxious about these things. Do you worry that the anxieties are too deep almost, and that some of the concern is damaging young people's lives?
I think the anxiety is more to do with lack of agency. I mean, people who work in things like Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, they're not anxious so much as concerned and angry and so on. Whereas the people I think that you're referring to are, there are copious surveys that show that anxiety levels about climate change in the young is a real phenomenon now. And there are all sorts of therapists dealing with these sorts of concerns. Well, yes, well, inevitably. But it's a real phenomenon, I accept that. I don't think it's because scaredy cats like me are breaking cover for the first time. I've never said these things I've said here before. I've been as inhibited as anyone else in following the IPCC and COP, as it were, logic of progressive change. It doesn't take account quite of your concerns, but and I feel we have to break through the ordinary scientific language to talk about these differences at a more intimate level.
Any more questions? Got one here.
I just wanted to say that John's been reading some of the IPCC bulk of the information. And the thing is, what they have in their main block of stuff is not the same as what they put out in the summary. They're saying the summary to say what they want to say about global warming and all the rest of it. But this isn't held out by some of the information, the data they have in the main block.
But perhaps I could sort of broaden this out a bit, and I mean, what we're hearing is strong scepticism about these acknowledged experts and authorities on these subjects, and that is a common theme of many aspects of our lives now. Michael Gove said we've all had enough of experts, and that people who are even doctors are not being trusted, politicians are certainly not being trusted, sadly journalists are not being trusted, IPCC scientists are not being trusted. No one's being trusted anymore to be a neutral, reliable authority motivated by public good rather than self-interest. As people who've been in public life and in academia, what are your reflections on this lack of trust in what used to be considered neutral authority figures who could give sensible, reasoned, rational advice? Now they are dismissed. How do you reflect on that?
Well, shall I go first and then you have a comment? I mean, I think it rather to the contrary, actually, Owen. I think that the skill, the political, the craft skill, the diplomatic skill in creating, in the first place, I was around when it was created, in the 80s, the IPCC. And the stitching together, very skilled bureaucrats stitching together this global alliance, of this global framework for scientists to feed into. But at the same time having the policy world connected to it, which I know for some people means that it was contaminated, but actually, because it was all predicated on there being potentially an enormous global problem, it was important to have governments connected to this process. And I think that was personally a fantastic political achievement to pull that together. Not just that, it stayed together. For the last 30 years, we have had experts who have actually commanded authority in the field. And I think they still do. And we can argue about the detail. I really don't accept that the summary, the synthesis representations of the IPCC's most recent report is somehow a distortion. Well, okay. No, I haven't read the full report. Well, then we're all in an impossible position, aren't we? You are the repositories of the
Let me come to you just for that same point about academics. Basically IPCC is academics, right? It's people
it's scientists,
scientists who've
I'd like to take us back 50 years and to consider a parallel example of doubts, and that is smoking. And you will recall that it was shown in the 1950s by a man called Sir Richard Dow that there was a very strong relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And the industry then took upon itself to sow doubt
and did it extremely successfully. So it then took decades for the well-established relationship between smoking and lung cancer to actually be implemented upon by governments. Now, I think, and interestingly enough, it was the same people that were working for the tobacco industry sowing doubts that in America have been working for big oil and big gas, sowing doubts about climate change with the source of data that you presented to us earlier on. So they have been very successful in this. The difficulty that we face now is a thing that Robin has stressed. In the case of the delay in responding to the known information about the dangers of smoking, people died, tough, but it wasn't a global catastrophe. What we're facing now is a different sort of dilemma, whereas the projections suggest that there's a strong possibility of major global breakdown. The flood in Pakistan is an example of this. If you look at the data in the Andes, at the rates at which glaciers are melting, and these glaciers are providing the water for important cities in the Andes. So that leads to a breakdown. And so it's a different order of magnitude, and it's a much harder problem. Therefore, science is bad, as Roger has pointed out, is bad at dealing with this. As a scientist, I rarely express certainty. Science is about doubt and uncertainty. Yet, the paradox is that the science now is suggesting there's a very high probability of catastrophe, and as Robin has pointed out. But science is bad at catastrophe because we say, oh, looking outside, there's something might happen to prove us wrong. But we don't have we can't afford to wait.
So you're saying the stakes are too high, basically, to debate it.
Well,
very much longer. Yeah, Roger.
Been great, this, hasn't it? I don't think 1.5, 2%, 2 degrees, sorry.
Yeah.
This is all up for debate, isn't it? And clearly, it's quite an aggressive debate. But I think the principle of chucking your rubbish into the atmosphere cannot be right. Whatever percentage and whatever's going to happen, it cannot be right. So the principle of doing that means that we need to have a concern about our planet. And not the most interesting, that would be rude, but the thing that resonated with me was the gentleman over here who said, what can we do? Yeah. Because we've clearly been abandoned by the politicians, haven't we? We've been abandoned by it because it's not good for votes, because it's commercially not sound. So it's not good for vote catching, and so we've been abandoned by the politicians. So if we have to do something, it's got to be at a community level, and I resonated with what the gentleman over there said, and that is insulate your house. Massive, massive impact. More than buying a Tesla, more than putting a propeller in your garden. Insulate your house, and that will make a massive, massive difference. And if we make a little difference, and in micro level, maybe Great Britain is too small to make a difference, but Rosnag is not too small to make a difference, because there's an ability to set an example to somewhere else, and then that might get taken up and spread. But that is all we can do. But the first thing you do is insulate your house. Good night.
Good.
I run a large insulation company.
Any more from... Yes, there's one there in the middle. Yeah.
I'd just like to clarify something. I mean, I've been involved in environmental sciences for a long time. The examples brought up with the Roman period, medieval period, I think Gareth intimated the difference between a global rise and regional rises. So they're simply regional rises. They don't in any way support what could be seen as Gareth is wrong in his assessment. So drawing out the difference between regional and global, those examples that were brought forward, the Roman period, the late medieval period, they were just simply regional rises. So I just want to it's a factual thing as far as I'm concerned. 1995, that paper came out, 1999, 2019, it was, changed as just, okay, we can look at those things, they're always useful, but the thrust of the discussion should sometimes just be calm on the facts. So I just want to support Gareth's analysis there. Sometimes the global and regional gets lost as when we look at the figures of 1.5.
Yes. So what you're saying is that when you're looking at the medieval and Roman periods, there could have been a regional effect rather than a global effect. I guess the other point about that is, which no one's really raised, is that in those periods, we've got 6 billion people on Earth.
Yeah.
Now, if you go to places like Pakistan, I mean, it is already on the edge. I mean, because there are just too many people. There's so many people. With very, very poor resources and technology and capacity to produce food and wealth. So that makes a difference, right? In terms of the vulnerability, the fragility.
Yes, the fragility. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's 8 billion now.
8 billion.
Yeah, that's right. I would like to ask the question, both speakers. If Rishi Sunak phoned you up tomorrow morning and said, look, I'd really like you to head up be Secretary of State for Climate Change to get this show on the road, right, to implement all the COP20, whatever, all the COP agreements, the IPCC recommendations. What would be on your to-do list for him to sort of get cracking on? I mean, we've heard sort of the bottom-up approach, if you like, insulate your house, all the rest of it. But it's got to come from the top down as well. What would you recommend?
Secretary of State for a day.
Okay. Thanks. Well, I think I would focus on discussion. Actually, I think I would mobilise a range of skills associated with encouraging discussions. I mean, at the moment, we don't know how to engage with these impasses. And I'd like to have an exploratory program of seeing, at local levels all over the country, people talking about the sort of clashes of perspective that we're talking about now. I mean, this is very disabling for all of us. That I can't really engage with these. I'm not going to call you a denier, but your perspective, because you're operating in different terms to the ones I'm operating in. I agree there are factual bases, but as Ian Forster said, people keep telling me to look at the facts. But which facts? I mean, there are so many facts. And so I'm answering your question. My focus would be a massive national program at getting these sort of things discussed, breaking through the sort of sedative effect of having it all characterized in terms of graphs and figures and so on.
And you're Secretary of State for a year now. If you were thinking about top-down policies rather than these bottom-up initiatives we've been hearing about.
Well, the gentleman talked about insulation. Our houses are incredibly uninsulated and badly built for the current environment, and it costs people money. So it's a net gain. So in terms of practical, you say roughly a third of the energy is used in space heating, another third is used in transport, crudely, right? Very roughly. So you'd look at those. and you'd say try to decrease the emissions from space heating, and you try and decrease the emissions from transport. You take a country like New Zealand, like Norway, something like 40% of the cars on the road in Norway are now EVs. They have the infrastructure, they have the backup. I have an EV out there, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the backup, and so I suffer from stress finding place to charge my car. And it can be quite difficult at times, but because of my personal commitment, I live with it. So yes, public transport is going downhill, so that's pushing people into their cars. But in a sense, we're going all the wrong ways. So there are lots of things you can do. And the other thing, of course, is really to push much more rapidly on renewables. The consequence will be that we are electrifying society and moving away from burning locally to electrifying society. So we're going to probably double the amount of electricity that we need now in the future. And that's a big ask. And so we really need to fivefold use it. Yeah, when you have an EV, you're roughly 3 times as efficient as running a petrol car. So you need 3 times less energy, but that energy is electricity, not petrol. But we don't want to go into the detail.
Okay, you've got a question here.
These questions have already been touched on by Gareth a bit. Our pension scheme, our banking scheme, our whole capitalist system depends upon annual economic growth.
Yeah.
So one question is it possible to address the question of climate change and maintain continual economic growth? That's one question. The other part, corollary of that is it possible to address climate change without everybody getting poorer in terms of their standard of living?
Well, it's the same question, really. I mean, both points are the same, aren't they?
It's the opposite side.
That's why the politicians don't want to go there, because people we're going to be poorer. Yeah.
So Robin's already addressed a bit of it. Is democracy? Do we need more democracy or less democracy? Is democracy part of the problem because people get the government they deserve?
Right, you're now Secretary of State with dictatorial powers.
We've got one already.
No, but I mean, it's a good question. I mean, people in this room, are they prepared to take a 1, 2, 3% hit on their living standard to deal with this? And I think the answer is the politicians don't think people are.
Right. Yeah, and therefore it's very unlikely, which is part of my argument. I mean, I'm not saying, I'm not personally, I leave this to Gareth, I'm not offering the prescriptions for change on the energy policy front. I'm just saying that this is the trajectory where we're heading. So I think you're right. I think it's very, very hard to picture, unless there's a huge change of heart, how you can shift the system we're on, that upper graph we're on, because politically it won't be acceptable. So I'm saying, okay, that's the situation. We need to talk about that, how we engage with it, not what do we do to change it, just what do we do to live with this prospect and how do we address it in relation to our children and so forth.
Well, Bobby just sent me okay, we'll go there. Now you're going to have to say a question. Yes?
I'm really nervous because I don't speak publicly, but you mentioned that 20% of the carbon
bit closer, please.
The emissions come from methane, and I'm wondering, because you haven't mentioned anything about a plant-based diet, are you pushing for plant-based diets as part of the
Should climate activists be vegetarians?
Vegans.
Yeah.
Vegan.
I find it a very difficult problem. Do you want me to respond?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, there's no doubt that methane is a major issue, and that meat eating has become much more prevalent, and that the methane is very different to CO2. It has a very rapid turnover, but is a much more efficient greenhouse warming gas. So we need to eat less meat. I'm reluctant to go down the no meat line because the countries that I've worked in, if you take the example I take is the Maasai in Kenya. Have we the right to tell the Maasai after hundreds of years that they can't have any cattle? Have we the right to tell the sheep and the goat herders of Central Asia that, you know, their lives are finished because we want to fly around and live in nice warm houses? I find that a difficult, you know, moral issue, and therefore I think we should eat little meat, but I don't think there's a global argument for saying everybody has to be vegetarian, because there's about a billion people who live on a symbiotic relationship with ruminants.
But what about in a country like this one?
Yeah.
What about in a country like this one? I mean, insulating houses costs a lot of money. Buying EV cars costs a lot of money. Giving up meat doesn't cost a lot of money.
Food lot. But there's another, you know, big issue here. That's yield is related to nitrogen, and every time you put nitrogen on a crop, you release nitrous oxide, which is another greenhouse gas. So feeding ourselves beyond 2040, 2050, to me, is a huge issue. But you don't want the technical side, do you?
No. We do.
Yes.
We're talking about methane. Human beings produce methane as well.
Yes.
Unfortunately. One graph that was missing was the relationship between the increase in world population, which has been quite substantial over the last few years, and the increase in global warming.
Well, I can preview a talk we've got coming up, although sadly I don't think it'll be next month as planned, on the threat to global population and how it is likely to decline quite significantly. I think that is what our speaker will be telling us. So maybe if you come to that, you will be reassured that...
Well, maybe you're suggesting we just let the status quo carry on.
Bobby had a point about tax incentives, or... You just get the mic, yeah. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
Given that I was minister for the year, I'd be very inclined to tax the fossil fuel companies and the major energy providers with windfall taxes, and possibly offer tax incentives for investing in alternative technologies.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Have we got any more questions? Just one here. Yeah.
Just a sort of.
You get quite close. If you go close to
Sorry,
me.
yeah, just sitting next to these guys, and obviously Mike here showed me some information, and basically global warming is increasing, and how much is it due to us putting the, obviously since the Industrial Revolution, and how much of it is just due to the fact there's a graph here showing that over God knows how many thousands of years, it's like a sine wave, and we're at the top of it at the moment. And
So it's cyclical.
Natural causes.
Right.
It's going to be hot anyway, and I don't disagree with the fact that we need to do something about it. But how much of what we're putting in as a society are we increasing it?
Okay, so the question is this just cyclical and there's nothing particularly unusual going on? I think we'll wrap it up after this. So when you both have a go at that.
Over to you.
Well, the climate has always changed, and there have been cycles, just as you're saying. We are now in a cycle that the anticipation would have been that there would be a gradual decline in temperature. and then interglacial. So that would be the anticipation. And it appears, I think, from that we saw that one thing just on this business of what we know very quickly. Science is very good at measuring things like the CO2 level in the atmosphere. You know, that's very clear. Tom Burke, Robin's friend, has a lovely graph of this. That's clear. We know the CO2 is going up. There is a very good scientific basis for saying that is increasing the global temperature, that it acts as a greenhouse gas. The more you go away from that basic information, the more uncertain the effects are going to be, right? So, but in terms of what you said, then there's always been change, but the evidence is quite compelling, in my judgment, partly from reading the documents, but partly, and more so, just from my experience of the communities I've been to, and seeing what's happened in Pakistan, seeing what's happened in South Africa, seeing how close Cape Town was to running out of water a few years ago. There are endless examples of this sort, right? So, as you say, more people, more pressure on the resources of the world, and you know, the fear is that we're running for catastrophe. Yes, there are changes, but these are new problems.
And the final word to you, Robin.
What final word? What can I say? Other than that, I hope we'll do more. I mean, I hope we'll talk more in this way, or perhaps in more inventive ways.
Thank you very much. Well, look, they've been tremendous speakers, and thank you very much to everyone for very lively debate. I think we can celebrate the fact that it's been very calm. Everyone's been very calmly expressing their points of view. And we're going to flog a book now.
Yeah.
Energy, the Great Driver. It's a must-read. It's a great birthday gift.
Yeah,
thank you. Can I just ask if anyone is a first-time thinker in this event and hasn't been before, we would be very glad to get your email. Can you just put your hand up if you've not been before to this? So would you mind, Rosemary, where's Rosemary? Has got a list for new, there we are. Would you mind just sort of giving an email to Rosemary, and then we can tell you what's coming up in the future. But thank you very much to our very distinguished speakers for bearing with us through an hour and a half of very intense discussion. So thank you very much indeed.
And add my thanks as well. One of the things that we'd like to do, if we possibly could, is try and keep a roof over our heads for the Anglesey Golf Club. So if you could possibly spare any cash for the roof fund. You see they're getting quite close, but basically they need to keep a roof over our heads. Yeah. Maybe insulate. Yeah. But thanks very much if you can. Now, the food will be starting to be served about 8 o'clock. Make sure you've got a ticket to get some food. If you haven't bought a ticket yet, then I'll see to you. But thank you.